Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Enda Wyley, and I'd like to welcome you to a very special event for this year's online Strokestown International Poetry Festival 2021. Well, this festival has long been a favourite of mine, and it gives me huge pleasure to be here today and to talk to three very fine poets about their work. But just to fill everyone in who's watching here today, last year in 2020, I was very privileged to judge the Strokestown International Poetry Prize with fellow judge and poet John F. Dean. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, both John and I were deprived of the pleasure of actually meeting with the winners and hearing them read their poems in the beautiful setting of Strokestown House. But today, as part of the 2021 online festival, I'm really delighted to actually meet the three winners of last year's poetry competition, to listen to some of their poems and to have a chat with them about their work. So Anne Mcdonald, Justin Hunt and Jane Wilkinson, you are very welcome today, and I'm looking forward to talking to you, to the three of you. So we'll start off with you first, Anne, and I'll introduce you to the listeners. Anne MacDonald lives in Bettystown, County Meath. Her writing has been published in many journals, and she was winner of the Ballina AIB International Poetry Competition, the Skerries Poetry Competition. She was shortlisted for the RTE Radio 1 Francis McManus Short Story Competition. Her debut poetry collection, Crow's Books, is just been published actually in 2021. And last year, Anne's poem, Whose Coat, received third place in the 2020 Strokestown International Poetry Competition. And it's such a memorable poem, and many congratulations on that win, Anne. I'm sure you were delighted with it, were you?
Oh, I couldn't believe it.
Were you happy with it, Anne?
I was so pleased because I've been entering Strokestown for almost 20 years, if not longer. And I entered back in the days when you actually posted your entry in. And I entered so many times I thought they might have been getting lost in the post. So it was just amazing. It's just been a fabulous competition, and I've watched it grow and grow and grow and take its place, you know, really way up there with any of the big major competitions. So yeah, I was absolutely delighted.
Yeah, and it's great as well that both John and I, they're judged anonymously. And so it's a huge surprise to us as well to discover who the three people are and who the runners-up are. So it's lovely. It's lovely to see you in person, Anne. But just to say, you're a highly creative person. You're not just a writer. You've tried stained glass art. You had a stint as a librettist. Performance work is so important to you. And you've said about your work, you said, for me, the joy is in the making, the trying, the doing, not necessarily the result, which is a really wonderful thing, I think, to say about creativity. Were you always creative, Anne? And when did you really get into writing?
I suppose I grew up in a very creative house where we didn't realise that it was creative. My mother would make, she would sew, she would bake. We never looked on that as anything other than just the way it was. We always entered competitions in the local show with flower arranging or, you know, painting, drawing. We just didn't think about it, and it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for us. But I always wrote. I always wanted to be a writer. And I did write for quite a few of my teenage years. And I wrote some dreadful, angst-ridden, awful poetry, which I still have.
Yeah.
So,
like
in my 20s, I did take a leap into performance poetry and loved it. And then I think, like a lot of people, life got in the way, you know, kids, work, jobs. And I really came back to writing full-time about 6 or 7 years ago. And that's when I started again to re-engage with performance. And now it's just what I do. I'm very, very lucky.
Yeah, and I know also that you went back to Trinity College in Dublin in your 50s to complete a BA in Irish Studies, and then you did an MPhil in creative writing, and you facilitate creative writing classes. They're all huge achievements, Anne, so well done. You're passionate about adults finding their voice, particularly after rearing families. I think that's really nice. But just from reading poems of yours, I've noticed how you often use writing to reveal someone else's point of view or experience. This is evident in your poem, Whose Coat, which obviously won the prize, but also in other poems of yours. And I was wondering, does this come easy to you, writing with great empathy about others?
Well, I suppose, Enda, I write a lot when I want to try and understand something, particularly whose coat. I really wanted to try and understand what is it like. And I think if you are creative, you're empathic. So I wouldn't say it comes easy, but I think it's a very interesting and a very rewarding way to write, to try and understand somebody else's experience. And, otherwise it's all about me. It's all about, what I've done, what I do, where I go. Much more interested to try and write and find out what it could be like to be in somebody else's shoes. So it's just something I'm always drawn to.
Yeah. Yeah. And also you've travelled a lot. You've lived in the US, you lived in Greece, Dublin. Talking of travel, actually, there's a really strong sense of place to I think it's a really wonderful poem really of yours that you're going to read for us now, Anne. It's called Bluebells and High Horses. And I'd love to hear it. I'm sure the others would too. And if you want to give us a brief introduction to it as well, we'd love to hear that as well.
Well, I suppose the briefest introduction I could give, to be really honest, is that it was written in the aftermath of a row where I came off the worst. It was my fault. I was 100% in the wrong. I got it on my high horse. And the poem was written about really how fragile memories and friendships are. And if we're not careful, we lose so much more than we win when we're trying to make a sanctimonious point. So if it's okay, I'll read it, and hopefully it explains itself. Is that okay?
And thanks very much, Anne. We'd love to hear it. Thank you.
So it's called Bluebells and High Horses. To smell a bluebell, you have to leave the road and find a path, carpeted with ferns and wild garlic, and trees dressed in ivy swaddling like lace on rough bark, to find a lilac-tinted pinafore around a trunk, and there you will see bluebells. I wanted you to smell them too, to remember how when we were young and we spent our hours talking to the ladybirds and black soft caterpillars we called God's horses, splitting grass and counting smells like honeysuckle and whitethorn blossoms and heady gorse webbed in silk in early spring. But here's the thing. I forgot I came here in a temper, wanting to be on my own and left alone. I stayed too long to find my way back to say, it wasn't you, it was definitely me. The road was empty and you were gone, and now it's hard to smell a bluebell from a high horse.
Oh, thanks very much, Anne. I don't think I'll look at bluebells again in the same way. It's lovely to hear that. So moving on to Justin now, and thanks for that again, Anne. Justin Hunt grew up in rural Texas and she retired from a long business career in 2012 in order to write. Justin's prose and poetry have won several awards. They've been published by a number of journals, anthologies and literary prize websites. He won second place in the 2020 Strokestown International Poetry Prize for his poem Every Day I Think of Those Years. And he lives with his wife Janet in Charlotte, North Carolina. So Justin, congratulations on your win at Strokestown last year. Were you pleased the way Anne was?
Absolutely. I was ecstatic, I think I could say. I had been a finalist the year before, and my wife and I actually attended the Strokestown Festival in 2019. And we left with a touch of magic, I would say. It's unlike any festival I've been to before or since. And it was a deep honor to have been placed second this year, or this past year, to have been part of that tradition.
Yeah, it's true. I think Touch by Magic is a good way of putting it, Justin. It's such a wonderful festival, isn't it?
Yes.
And to be in the big house for that prize giving ceremony is such a treat, isn't it? So well done last year as well. So really good as well that you came second last year. So it's brilliant. It seems to me when I read your poems as well, Justin, that family and moments caught within that unit matter very much to you in your poetry. in the poem that John F. Dean and I chose last year, every day I think of those years, a father is yearning for the early years of fatherhood in Germany. And I loved the line, the cool fennel-laden air of northern summer nights. It's beautiful. And the father cycling his young son home after a happy evening spent with friends and family. Ken, I was just wondering, could you talk a little bit about that catching of family moments within your work and how important they are to you?
Yes, place has always been extremely important to me. And if I may, Wenda, I'll say that I grew up in rural Kansas, not Texas, right. If I may just note that for the record.
Sorry for saying that.
No, that's quite all right. They sound a lot alike, don't they? But in this case, the poem was about those years in Germany when my wife, son, and I lived in a beautiful place, and I was working in Germany. And we later lost our son at age 23. And I think that was just an effort to capture the magic of those early years in a particular place. So in that particular poem, it was about that relationship and loss, an effort with the writing to bridge time and to make a present moment of something that was so deeply in the past. And it's hard to articulate what that's really all about. But other poems I write have to do with place and childhood memories and the loss of that rural Kansas life, which is no more, not even in the place where I grew up. So there is a sense of place and family.
Yeah. And it's, I think, very poignantly, you bring the death of your son into your poetry, the tragic loss of it, and also your mother's roots in the Missouri Ozarks. Isn't that right? You've written about that. And
yes.
Your father was born in 1897, is that right, to
that
Kansas settlers. Yeah. When you think of it, a time really far removed from the kind of culture and society we're living in now. So these are all really rich moments to capture in your poetry, aren't they, Justin?
Yes. My father was 53 when I was born. He was probably 7 or 8 years old when he first saw an automobile. And his father was a cattleman, and they were out on the prairie buying and driving cattle to market. And it was just an utterly different way of life. And something of that seeped into my own life all those years later. And I think I was imbued with that sense of pioneer culture that people perhaps even in my own generation didn't get because their fathers or mothers were much younger.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I know, Justin, like Anne, we were talking about travel there. You've travelled a lot. You're fluent in German. You've read widely in that language. Has travel and your love of languages, because I know your degree was in Spanish and Latin American studies as well, and you've a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. But has travel and your love of languages affected your writing?
Undoubtedly. I do read widely in German. I know that writing in English, which is my mother tongue, of course, is shaped by the other languages that I speak, particularly German, in a way that I can't quite pin down, but I know it's there. And perhaps it's the syntax. I don't try to analyze it, but yes, living in different places and especially our long association with Germany has had an impact on what I do.
Yeah, it's interesting. And now, Justin, I'd love to hear you read a poem of your own. It's called Afternoon on Slate Creek. I thought it was a really beautiful poem with a wonderful last line. I won't give it away, but we can hear it now. And if you'd like to lead us into it, Justin, that would be fantastic.
Very good. Thank you for the opportunity. This poem is about my earliest memories with my father, who took me when I was young, maybe 3 or 4 years old, fishing on a small creek east of where we grew up. And I think that sets the context for it, and I'll just read it. And I might say the attribution here is to B.H. Fairchild, an American poet who's influenced me very heavily, a fellow Kansan and a writer of place. Afternoon on Slate Creek, after B.H. Fairchild. In his 5th summer, the boy fishes from a low bank, his father next to him, Sumner County, awash in the rattle and whoosh of cottonwoods, the crackle of grasshoppers stripping brush. Behind them, cattle shuffle over clumps of cactus and milkweed, rasping the ground with their swollen tongues, moaning and hoofing as if to hew rain from shorn grass and dirt. From the west, a rumble. The father, nearly 60, squints skyward through cataracts, sweat rippling his chin. When he looks down, his son's bobber jerks, then dives. "Pull her in," he shouts. The boy cranes his pole, hoists a perch into sunlight, and shrieks. The father unhooks the fish, holds it in his palm so the sun can finger its soft red gills, the cold snag of its mouth. The storm drums closer. Locusts drill the air, crows caw, stinkbait, slow water, and creekside weeds snake the boy's nostrils, strike memory as he runs his hand over fins and scales. This moment, this place, his father's face.
Oh, that's lovely, Justin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so thank you, Justin and Anne. And last but not least, we'll now move on to Jane Wilkinson. Jane was the winner of the Strokestown International Poetry Prize 2020 for her poem If I Were to Land, a striking poem as much about love as it is about loss, and ultimately I think the heartbreak that freedom can bring. Jane is the recipient of other poetry prizes too. She received first and second place in the Guernsey International Poetry Competition 2020 and was also the winner of Against the Grain Poetry Press Competition in 2019. She was second in the Waltham Forest Poetry Competition in 2018, and Jane is a landscape architect from London and she's living in Norwich. So Jane, you're very welcome. So, Jane, well done on receiving first place in the competition last year. Great news to get, I'm sure. Were you pleased?
Absolutely delighted, over the moon. Yeah, it was great. And I couldn't believe it, actually. It was such a lovely festival. I mean, I've never been myself, but people have told me who've been and read there that it's, one of the best. It's such an amazing experience to go. So the only disappointment was that I couldn't actually attend after.
I know, yeah.
So it was such a, I know, it was hard, but you had to put it in context at the beginning of lockdown. But yeah.
And who knows, or come along to the festival, because when things get back to normal. Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Would be
well, I have to say, I feel so lucky talking to you and Anne and Justin, because you're all such creative and inspiring people. Jane, you studied at Camberwell Art School, London. You've worked at the South Bank Centre, followed by the National Gallery. You were in touch with me before the interview and you said, I see poems as rooms hung with objects, ideas and images in dialogue with each other. Can you talk a bit about this and what exactly you mean by it?
Well, yeah, I've thought about the relationship between art making, which I don't really engage in seriously or professionally anymore, fine arts, that is, and the relationship with the writing. That's definitely my key creative practice currently. And I used to write a lot when I was making art anyway. I used to write lots of notes. But in terms of the individual poems, I mean, obviously stanza itself means room. So it's this container for me for images that emerge in the writing or things that I find. And then the relationship and the context between them seems to it's a sort of flow between the two. I often start writing from description. And if I'm interested in an idea, I might go to an image to do research rather than text. So I'm I tune into images and write from them and find ideas actually arise from image. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in terms of that particular poem, there were two thoughts. One was a description of a real event that had happened with the woodcock. And the other was I imagined it as I started writing as a kind of twisted idea. So a kind of barley twist of two ideas folding into each other. So that's how the structure emerged for me. But it's sort of like being in a gallery space and looking between all the paintings and how it's a kind of curated thing, I suppose. A poem is a curated space of idea.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you talking about that, and really about the craft and the way that you make your own poems, because everybody is different. So that was really interesting to hear. As poets as well, I think the reading of other poems feeds our work and our development as writers. But by your own admission, Jane, you said you didn't really read contemporary poetry prior to 2011. So I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about how you came to reading and subsequently to the writing of poetry?
Yeah, so I had, as a child, read poetry, and I actually found recently a book of children's poems, which I knew to be a really familiar image in my head. So I thought, this is a book I used to read as a child. And also, I have a couple of books, Edward Thomas that comes to mind, that I read at school that I really adored, actually. But it was very limited. But so in 2011, I was working as a landscape architect, and I had to take quite a prolonged period of time from work. Because I was grieving for things that had been happening in my life, and I just had to get some space. And I remembered a poem that I'd heard on the radio, and from a few years before. And I went to the poetry library, which is an amazing space, an incredible resource, and sort of gave them a few of the fragments that I remembered. They said, "Oh, we know what that is." So how they do it, I don't know, but it was great. And it was Jen Hadfield's 90 Place book that I started reading, and this amazing world of poetry just erupted in front of me. And I was in the right place at the right time. In London, I could get access to all sorts of writing and the poetry school. And after a couple of years of reading huge amounts of poetry, American contemporary poetry, British, and I embarked on courses at the poetry school, and started from there really. And now it's what I do. It feels kind of impossible to imagine life without it, really.
That's a great story. That's absolutely brilliant. It's like all the floodgates opened and you were just reading and reading. Yeah, the poetry library, what a great resource. That's true. And also that this one poem just sent you off on this journey, or this one poet. Yeah. So we started talking about the importance of art to you. And I know you're going to read now a very intriguing, I think, an inventive poem of yours written about a piece of art made by the artist Jacob Epstein. So would you introduce the poem for us? We'd love to hear it.
Okay, thank you. So the poem I'm going to read is, it's actually in Magma magazine, Act Your Age issue from last year. And in Norwich, where I live now, I'm really lucky to have the resource of the Sainsbury Centre, which holds the collection, the art collection from Lisa and Robert Sainsbury. So I was in the gallery one day, and I was making notes generally on work that I could see. So this particular poem started as an observation from a sculpture by, as you say, Enda Jacob Epstein. It was actually his first ever sculpture, and he'd lived in the States. He's considered Anglo-American, but he just moved in 1902 to Paris, and the infant that he modelled was brought into his studio in Paris. And I was really drawn to it in the gallery, not only for its delicate handling, but the poignancy of this head without a body lying on its side and displayed as if it was asleep or, of course, not living. And the date was very important to me, actually, made at the birth of the 20th century. And it was hard to imagine that adult that the adult that the baby became that was not directly affected by the wars of the 20th century. Also, I will say, to save confusion, I should say that the word caul in the poem is caul, which is the birth membrane. Baby Asleep in 1902, after Baby Asleep, Jacob Epstein. Newborn baby, you are 117 years old. Pure white sleep on a pillow shelf. Your head, so alone, is life-size, is the size of your mother's still puffy, grieving womb. Perfect puckered chin, lower lip withdrawn to pout, a comfort suckle from inside this bronze caul. The only dreaming witness to a flaming cauldron in a petrified forest. In the wedge of air behind the left ear, unseen, nonetheless attentively modelled, contours are lucid as Holbein's pencil portraits, and the right ear is formed by 3 strong finger holes, pressed tenderly, but as if they'd held a hardening eggshell too long. The metal is green-black of a shriveled umbilical. Yours must have been still tied like a pig's tail to long since lost a flesh body. Zipped in, half-grown eyeballs simmer in their bindings. You have yet to know the importance of learning how to lie.
Thank you very much. So that was Jane Wilkinson, and she was reading her own poem, Baby Asleep, in 1902. Thanks for that, Jane. And now for the next section of this event, where I've asked the 3 poets here today to choose a poem by a poet that they admire, and just to talk a little bit about why they love it. And then we're going to get the treat of them actually reading it for us. It's absolutely brilliant to meet the 3 of you today, and I'm really looking forward to this section. So I'm going to go back now to Anne again. I hope you're enjoying all that, Anne. It's very interesting to hear everyone talking, isn't it?
Absolutely amazing.
So nice.
And it's so amazing to hear people reading, and the range of experiences. It's such a privilege.
Yeah, that's right. It feels like a privilege to me as well. So, Anne, what poem have you chosen, and why do you like it?
Well, I suppose the poem I've chosen comes from a collection by Leonard Nimoy, and it came as an amazing shock to me that Spock from Star Trek actually wrote poetry, and I was given a gift of his collection when I was 21, and it blew my mind because it certainly helped me bridge the pages and pages of angst-ridden, aforementioned drivel that I'd been writing. And this poem really stood out to me because, like all of Leonard Nimoy's poems, it's so short, it's so simple, it's just a few lines, and it is so powerful. So once, as I said, I got over the shock that Dr. Spock could write poetry, I became an absolute fan. And I would say very much influenced by that idea that things don't have to be complicated to be powerful or to be magical. So it's very, very short, and it's called If Love Can Be. If love can be withdrawn, it never was. My love for you is not a gift to you, it is a gift to me. And that's it.
Short and sweet. I mean, it's a shock to me as well that Spock was writing poetry.
I know.
But isn't it wonderful that a short poem can be so punchy and can really hit you? I'm reminded of Simon Armitage, who edited a lovely collection actually called, I think it's Short and Sweet, and he said that the power of a short poem should never be underestimated. So that short, punchy thing, it was beautiful to hear that. Thanks very much, Anne. And now we're going to move on to Justin. Justin, if you could lead us briefly into your choice of a poem by somebody else, and why do you like it so much?
All right. I'm going to read a poem by Ilya Kaminsky, a Russian-American poet who was born in Odessa in the former Soviet Union, I think in 1977, and immigrated to the U.S. in the early 90s when he was still in his teens. He is deaf almost deaf and requires the use of very powerful hearing aids. What I find remarkable about this poem, which is the first poem in his debut collection, Dancing in Odessa, is the way it treats the subject of the book that he produced. His dive into memories of early childhood and family in Odessa, into a place that is no more. With, of course, it's inside him and has its own reality. And there's a simplicity and a supplication about this poem as he approaches that task of writing. Author's Prayer by Ilya Kaminsky. If I speak for the dead, I must leave this animal of my body. I must write the same poem over and over, for an empty page is the white flag of their surrender. If I speak for them, I must walk on the edge of myself. I must live as a blind man who runs through rooms without touching the furniture. Yes, I live. I can cross the streets asking, what year is it? I can dance in my sleep and laugh in front of the mirror. Even sleep is a prayer, Lord. I will praise your madness, and in a language not mine, speak of music that wakes us, music in which we move. For whatever I say is a kind of petition, and the darkest days must I praise.
Justin, that's beautiful. And it's so relevant as well, isn't it, for the times that we're in, I think.
Yes.
I hadn't actually read that poem before, so I think what's wonderful about this section as well, that we're being introduced to work by other poets that possibly we haven't encountered before. So many thanks for sharing that, Justin. So
My
that was
pleasure.
Justin Hunt. Yeah, it was beautiful. That was Justin Hunt reading Author's Prayer, a poem by Ilya Kaminsky. And now to Jane. Jane, you seem to be always last, but not least, as I said earlier on. Jane, what poem did you choose and why did you choose? I know you spoke a little bit about this earlier, but you have a strong connection with this poet.
Yes, I do. So I've chosen Jen Hadfield's poem Daedra. So Jen lives, and I mentioned how actually already that I've kind of found the poem. It was so stunning on the radio that I held on to it for 3 years, just running parts of it through my mind. So I had to go and find it. So Jen lives in Shetland, and she writes extensively about place, and for me with a curiosity and wit that I find utterly transporting. And however many times I read this particular poem, I'm still delighted by the language and her evocation through both reverence and irreverence of the natural world here in a rock pool. I love the musical incantation of the poem, a prayer of praise to the world. Daedra, the title, is the Shetland word for slack or turn of the tide, and it's a pause of the kind I think I'm always hoping to step into. The word mind in the poem works on me in different ways, being to remind, to take care of, and to pay attention to. Daedra. I go to the rock pool at the slack of the tide, to mind me what my poetry's for. It has its ventricles, just like us, pumping brine like bull's blood, a syrupy flow. It has its theatre, hushed and plush. It has its little shop of horrors. It has its crossed and dotted monsters. It has its cross-eyed beetling Lear and its billowing Monroe. I go to the rock pool at the slack of the tide to mind me what my poetry's for. For monks, it has barnacles to sweep the broth as it flows with fans, grooming every cubic millimetre. It has its ebb, the easy heft of rack from rock, like plastered, feverish locks of hair. It has its flood. It has its welling god with puddled, podgy cheeks and jaw. It has its holy hiccup. its minute's silence. Daedra. I go to the rock pool at the slack of the tide to mind me what my poetry's for.
Oh, absolutely beautiful and really beautifully read as well. Thank you so much, Jane, for sharing with us Daedra. I hope I'm saying it correctly. A poem by Jen.
I think that's, yeah.
Is that it? Have I got it right?
Yeah, I've heard her on YouTube, and I've got the pronunciation. I hope you have it too. Yes,
very beautiful, beautiful poem, and thank you so much for introducing her to her work as well. I actually haven't read her either, but I would definitely be going to seek her out. So that's a poem by Jen Hadfield, and indeed I have come to the end now, sadly, and I just want to say thank you to all our guests today, to Anne Mcdonald, to Justin Hunt, and to Jane Wilkinson for sharing some of their poems with us, and all three for sharing the poems that they like as well, which is brilliant. All three were winners in the 2020 Strokestown International Poetry Festival, so congratulations to the three of you. I'm Enda Wyley. I'd like to say thank you to Strokestown Online Festival 2021 for inviting us here today, to the director Melissa Newman and her brilliant committee for programming and making possible such a great festival. Thank you to my husband and fellow poet Peter Sir for his production work on this short video, and thank you all for listening on this May Bank Holiday weekend. Really hope that you're going to enjoy the rest of the festival, and maybe, who knows, Justin, Anne, myself and Jane and Peter and everyone else, we might meet again in Strokestown. Here's hoping to that. So thank you for listening, everyone, and thank you to Justin, Anne and Jane. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Enda. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.